Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today we're taking a look at 3 dongles, but I haven't gone so far as calling this a dongle fondle as I tend to do when it's a mini dongle review, and that's because this one's really going to focus just on the 3. There's a couple of comparisons thrown in, but it's not quite the scale of a normal dongle fondle. And the 3 dongles I'm specifically looking at today are the Ikko Zerda ITM02, the Hidizs S9 Pro, and also the new, and this is like brand new, Hidizs XO. And so the timing of this review has been moved around a fair bit, but it's been released right now to coincide with the launch of the XO dongle. And so at one stage I was going to review the XO on its own, but I figured it'd be a good idea to kind of put it in the context of a couple of others around the same price, one cheaper, one a little bit more expensive. And I've got some other comparisons thrown in too. So without further ado, let's take a look at these 3 dongles. As always with these sorts of reviews, I'm going to run you through the 3 different models I've got here, what their pricing is, what their general feature sets are, and we're going to start as always with the cheapest, and that in this case is the Ikko Zerda ITM02. This is a $59 dongle, and as you can see here, it's absolutely tiny. Some time back, I reviewed the ITM01, which was a bit of a chunkier device. It was more of a fly lead style with a unique connector. It had multiple music modes, but I have to say, I just love the fact that this one's so tiny. The ITM01 was good, but I think this is better, both in terms of sound, as we'll get to soon, but also in terms of its form factor and simplicity. In the box with this one, you get a couple of cables, and I think this is great, which is that they include a USB-C to USB-C for Android users, and then you also get USB-C to Lightning if you're an Apple user. So all bases are covered with one version of the ITM02, whereas when we get to the 2 Hidizs products, both of those are USB-C only. A couple of other details to run through on the ITM02 is that it's built around the AK4733 DAC chip for those that care about DAC chips. It will decode PCM up to 384 kHz and DSD at a 128 level. It's single-ended only, there's only space for 3.5mm on there, and that 3.5mm output will give you 70 milliwatts into 32 ohms, which is going to be plenty for any kind of portable headphones, IEMs, etc., but it means it's not a device that you're going to be buying to drive difficult to drive headphones, so do keep that in mind if that's relevant to you. The final thing to mention here for those that use Tidal and care about MQA is that the ITM02 does not decode MQA. Likewise, when we get to it, the S9 Pro doesn't, but the XO does. So keep that in mind. If MQA is a thing for you, the XO is the best out of this lineup in terms of the functions that it has. But of course, sometimes pure sound quality can trump features like MQA, so watch on and see which one you like the sound of more. Having introduced the ITM02, let's now take a look at the next most expensive in this roundup, and that's going to be the Hidizs XO, so the new player, the new kid on the block if you like. And at the time that I'm recording this, I don't know exactly what it's going to cost. Hidizs have told me that it should sit somewhere under 100, but that could mean 99, it could mean 59, I don't really know. I'll put a price here on screen if I happen to know the price by the time I do the editing for this one, but otherwise you will have to follow the link down in the description below to check out the price of the Hidizs XO. What I can tell you about it though, is it's using a pair of ES9219 DAC chips, and that allows it to once again decode, same as the ITM02, it'll decode PCM 384 kHz, but this one will go up to DSD 256. So for DSD users, the XO is slightly more capable on DSD, if that makes a difference to you. And then some other areas of difference is that this one does offer balanced output. So you've got down on the bottom of this one both a 3.5 and a 2.5mm output, and that balanced output will give you 195 milliwatts into 32 ohms. So we're talking nearly 3 times the power of something like the ITM02. So if you do have more difficult headphones to drive, the XO is going to be immediately potentially a better choice than the ITM02. Having said that, I just want to remind people that if you've got a normal everyday headphone, none of them need anywhere near the 70 milliwatts that the ITM02 offers at 32 ohms. Of course, at different impedances that will change. So at 64 ohms, the ITM02 is probably giving you around about 35 milliwatts. So do take that into account. But generally speaking, in my experience playing with these, the ITM02 is going to drive basically anything you're likely to use in a portable setup. And so while it's nice to have 195 milliwatts on tap here from the balanced outputs, I don't think it's absolutely necessary in most cases. A few other things to take into account about the XO is that it also offers some filter functions. At the time of recording, there are only 2 filters on this one, but I believe there's going to be a firmware update in the future that might bring a third. And it's just like any other filter on any other DAC, where it's altering the way that the high frequency sounds are filtered off, and that can change the character of the sound in subtle ways. The way you change the filter is with the round button on here. And then there's also this X button, which is where the XO comes from. It's got the X and the O. And what the X button is doing for you is that's going to change the lighting effects down the side of the device. And this is pretty cool if you're someone that likes a bit of kind of RGB lighting in your life. Maybe you're like me and you've got an RGB keyboard and you kind of enjoy that little bit of flare and that little bit of color. If you do buy yourself an XO, you can click the X button once it's plugged in and cycle through multiple different color schemes. One thing that's worth noting, and this might get changed in firmware, is that currently it defaults to the lights being switched off, and that means if you do have a favorite color scheme or pattern, you have to cycle through each time to find the one you like. So it would be nice if this somehow remembered the setting it was on when you last used it, but it's a cool new innovative feature, and I'm always a fan of those sorts of things. As I said, the firmware might fix it so in the future it remembers the setting it was last on, but every time I've plugged it in, it starts off with no RGB lights on, and then you've got to switch it on if you want it. Beyond that, the XO is just a normal, standard-looking USB dongle, USB-C at one end, and the outputs at the other, exactly the same as the ITM02, and exactly the same as the S9 Pro. So let's get to the S9 Pro now. The S9 Pro retails for $119 US, making it not that much more expensive than what the XO is likely to be at that sort of sub $100 mark. And the S9 Pro has for a long time now been kind of a staple in the industry as a highly recommended dongle. I reviewed the original S9 and I wasn't a huge fan. It wasn't a bad dongle, but it was a little bit thin sounding for my tastes. And so I was interested to hear if the S9 Pro was actually significantly better. With the S9 Pro, you're getting an ES9038Q2M chip, just the one of them, unlike the dual chips in the XO. And the S9 Pro is the most capable in this roundup of those that can decode high-level signals. What I mean by that is it will take PCM all the way up to 768 kHz and DSD 512. So again, if you are a high sample rate person, maybe you're using it with pre-upsampled files on your phone, or maybe you're using it with a computer and using an upsampler, the S9 Pro can handle the highest possible levels, whereas the other two sit a bit behind. Just like the XO that we just spoke about, the S9 Pro also offers 3.5 and 2.5mm balanced output, so 3.5 being single-ended, 2.5 being balanced. It's also USB-C in at the end, and as I mentioned before, both of the Hidizs come with USB-C to USB-C cables and a USB-A to USB-C adapter, but there's no lightning connection. Now, I'm not an Apple user, so I'm not familiar with the current world of how to connect devices like this to Apple. I don't know if that means you need a camera connection kit, or if there's a different version of these available. You'll probably need to check that out for yourself, because I'm not clear on that one. What I can tell you though, is that from the 2.5mm output on the S9 Pro, you're getting at 200 milliwatts into 32 ohms. So it's fractionally more powerful than the XO, but that 5 milliwatts isn't going to make a huge difference. It is also worth mentioning that with any of these devices that have balanced, the power figures that I'm telling you for the balanced, if you basically halve that, you're going to have a rough figure and a pretty close figure to what the single-ended is going to give you. So in both cases, we're talking 90 to 100 odd milliwatts for single-ended, and that's plenty. And again, if you think about it that way, it puts them all pretty close in terms of the power through single-ended. We've got 70 milliwatts here, 90 odd milliwatts here, and 100 odd milliwatts here. Again, all of them are plenty powerful enough for any IM on the planet, and also for most portable style headphones. And so with all that said, the big question here is really, how do they sound? Because when it comes to dongles, there's not a lot to talk about. You plug them in, you switch them on, you get the volume to the right level, and that's pretty much it. It all comes down to how will they process the sound and how will they deliver the analog output through to your headphones or earphones. And so I kicked off my listening test, as you'd expect, with the ITM02 at the bottom end of the ladder. The sound from the ITM02 is very enjoyable, as I've kind of come to expect from Ikko. It's smooth, it's clean, but it's not smoothed off, it's not lacking any detail. It's just got a good sense of balance to it. It's not overly bright, not overly warm, it's just really enjoyable to listen to. For a pretty budget dongle, it provides a good sense of space and separation and imaging focus. And the fact that it has got that slightly sort of smoother, and I'm not going to say warm, but smooth sound, means it's an excellent combination with an IEM like the IE900. And so most of my testing, I bounced back and forth with these dongles between the IE900 as a fairly dry, fairly neutral sounding IEM, and also the Beyerdynamic Xolento 2, which is a bit warmer, a bit more forgiving in some ways. And the reason I did that was that I found the IE900 can sometimes sound a bit too dry on a very, very neutral device, and the Xolento 2s can sound a bit boomy and bloaty if you've got an overly rich and warm device. And the good news is the ITM02 sits right in the middle really nicely. It worked beautifully with the very neutral IE900, and it still sounded great with the richer, warmer Xolento 2. And so it was now time for my first direct comparison. I looked through my collection of what I still had here from previous reviews, and one of the options was the xDuoo Link version 2. Not the balanced, just the single-ended version, and the reason I chose that was because A, both are single-ended only, and B, the Link 2 comes in at $55 US. Whereas, as I said before, the ITM02 sits at 59, so within $4 of one another. I really liked the Link V2 when I tried it, I think in the original Great Dongle Fondle, and so I figured it was going to be good competition, but it really wasn't much of a competition. The ITM02 is clearly better. This is a lovely, lovely little dongle DAC. A, it's really compact, B, it's really affordable, and C, it sounds fantastic. What I heard when comparing it to the Link V2, which is still not a bad dongle by any stretch, but what I noticed was that the Link V2 sounded much more closed in. It had a much smaller soundstage, much less separation of the sounds, and the ITM02 was just more enjoyable overall. The Link V2 seemed to give a bit more mid-range emphasis, and I think that's part of what kind of closed things in. And I'm not suggesting here that it somehow is changing the frequency response, because if you measure any decent dongle, it's going to show you a flat frequency response from 20Hz to 20 kHz. And so what's really going on is it's the way the signal is then being handled in the output stage, delivered through your headphones, how the headphone drivers are being controlled. It's all those sorts of things that will alter the sound quality, not so much a specific frequency response change. And what I heard as I compared the two was that however the Link V2 has been designed, the filters it's using, whatever it might be, it's just giving a bit more mid-range weight. And for some people that might be good, but for me it closed in the soundstage a bit too much, and I definitely prefer the ITM02. And one of the key reasons for that preference was what I've already mentioned being the spaciousness of the ITM02 in comparison, but also it comes across a bit more resolving. And again, it could just be because the extra mid-range kind of weight and thickness from the Link V2 is taking away a little bit of the sense of detail and clarity by kind of masking the subtle signals. Or it could be that the ITM02 is actually resolving more details. Either way, to me, the ITM02 was giving me a good balance of refinement and smoothness, but detail and clarity too, and for me, it's the better choice in that $50 to $60 range. And so at this point, I put down the Link V2, I kept the ITM02 on hand because I wanted to see how did it compare when I jumped up to the XO, remembering I don't know exactly what the XO is going to cost. It might end up being identical to the ITM02, maybe a little bit more, but we know it's going to be under 100, so it's kind of in the vague ballpark that it might be for someone a choice between spending a little bit less on the ITM02 or taking that extra step to get the XO, getting some more power if you feel you need it, and getting balanced output too. And MQA if that's relevant too. Going over to the XO and running it balanced, what I immediately heard was a better sounding dongle. And that's normally the case. You normally get more for your money as you spend more money on dongles, and the simple reason for that is there's better quality components being put into them. All of these manufacturers have choice of a range of different, say, resistors, capacitors, the processing chips, all of that, there is a range of choices. And so a high quality resistor or capacitor costs more money, and therefore a device using a high quality resistor or capacitor in each spot is going to cost more. And I believe that's probably what's going on here. In the case of the XO, a couple of things that Hidizs talk about in their marketing is the use of the dual DAC chips, which is often a good way to keep channel separation strong, and then also the fact that they're using a high quality oscillator. Now an oscillator is the thing that helps to define the timing of the DAC processing, and having a better quality processor reduces jitter, which makes the sound better. And certainly that's what I heard from the XO. It's got a very refined and very detailed sound that's reminiscent of the ITM02, but just taken up a notch. It once again strikes a great balance where it works with the slightly warmer Xolento 2 and the slightly drier and more neutral IE900s. As I said before, for those using Tidal, you've also got MQA if you want to get that more sort of spacious delivery that MQA can give you. Obviously there's some issues with MQA. I'm not suggesting MQA is the best thing ever, but some people like it. Some people only have access to Tidal, and therefore it can be very relevant to some people. I mentioned before that the XO has the different filters, and so I tried the two that are available at the time of this review, that being the blue filter and the red filter, and it definitely made a bit of a difference, and to me, I prefer the blue filter. The blue filter comes across being slightly smoother in overall sound, but with also a better sense of clarity. The red filter almost gets a bit shouty or something. It's a very subtle shift, as all these filter changes are, but I started to find myself a little bit fatigued with the red filter and much more relaxed listening with the blue filter. So that's my choice, but it's a quick click of a button. You can try it for yourself if you get an XO. Another thing that's important to note when you're using a device like this is that sometimes the quality of the balanced output can be vastly better than the quality of the single-ended. Something like the E-Man Sparrow being a great example. But the good news is that here with the XO, there's no such problem. The difference between the balanced and the single-ended output is minimal, and if anything, I almost like the single-ended better. Going to the single-ended gave it a bit more body and a bit more smoothness with no loss of anything else. Sometimes what I find is going to the single-ended closes in the soundstage a little bit, maybe you lose a bit of a sense of detail and resolution or left-right separation. But in the case of the XO, I actually felt like it just gave it a bit more body and presence and nothing else different, and I really liked it. So the XO wins huge points for me in that it's a dongle that you can buy and plug in any IM or headphone, whether it's single-ended or balanced, and expect good sound. Assuming it doesn't need buckets and buckets of power, of course. And so at this point, I was really impressed with what I heard from the XO. And it made me a bit excited to see if spending the extra $20 odd or whatever it's going to end up being to get to the S9 Pro is going to be an even greater jump again. And so I parked the XO temporarily, and don't worry, I will come back around and talk about how the XO compares to some other dongles shortly. But I parked the XO for now, having identified to myself that it's clearly an upgrade from the ITM02, in the same ballpark in terms of tonality and sound, but better in terms of resolution and separation of sound. And then I moved on to the S9 Pro. My first impressions of the S9 Pro are that it delivers a sound that's very clean, but with a great sense of punch to it as well. There's a clearly different presentation going from the XO to the S9 Pro, and I'd say both are good, but they're clearly different. The S9 Pro once again delivers a soundstage which is a good size, with a good sense of imaging and focus. The single-ended and the balanced performance is once again very comparable. Whether you plug into either one doesn't seem to matter too much. The single-ended is probably a touch smoother on the top end, but other than that, they're very, very similar. And so at this point, what I was hearing was another dongle, which is excellent, but now it came to the question of which one might be better. Because as I said before, there was a difference between the XO and the S9 Pro. The S9 Pro came across a bit cleaner sounding, or maybe a bit more upper end focused with the treble, having a bit more emphasis to it, but also a great sense of punch. And so I was curious to see just how they compared between the XO and the S9 Pro. I heard straight away they were different, but I wanted to go quickly back and forth on exactly the same track and see really what I was hearing. One of the tracks I used to compare these two was Meet Joe Black by Nas, or Nas, or Nas, I'm not sure. Let me know in the comments if you know how that's meant to be pronounced. I haven't actually Googled it to find out, as you can probably tell. And so I started off with Meet Joe Black, and I went back and forth using the balanced outputs and trying both the IE900 and the Xlento 2s to see whether I preferred the S9 Pro or the XO, or if they're both just as good as one another. And starting off with the XO, what I found was that the top end with something like the IE900 was getting just a little bit too crispy for me. It was a bit too edgy, a bit too bright on a track like this, but I think it's more because the samples in the track aren't the highest quality, and it was revealing that to me through the IE900s. The bass from the XO and the IE900 was solid and punchy, and the vocal quality was really articulate and clean. And that's what you'd expect for a rap track like this, where the vocal is really important to the mix. It's normally the prominent part of the mix, and it definitely came through from the XO with the IE900s. And the same was also true for the Xlento 2, taking into account the differences between the IEMs. Moving over to the S9 Pro with exactly the same track, and the very first thing that stuck out was a much fuller sense of bass punch. On top of that, there was a bit of extra kind of detail or presence in the treble, and the S9 Pro started to sound to me almost a little bit V-shaped. And I want to backtrack to something I said before. None of these would measure as having anything but a flat frequency response between 20 Hz and 20 kHz, give or take, a dB maybe. But what you hear when you compare the S9 Pro to the XO is a slightly different sound, with the XO sounding a bit more kind of neutral or balanced across all frequencies, and the S9 Pro almost coming across a tiny bit V-shaped due to its ability to provide that punch in the bass and that bit of extra crispness and clarity in the treble. And so by the end of my switching back and forth on Meet Joe Black, What I found was that I was definitely preferring the sound of the XO. I liked the fact that it was a little bit smoother, but I didn't feel like I was really missing anything. That said, I was keen to try another track because I wasn't yet convinced whether or not it was just a case of the track suiting them better, or if I actually liked the general tuning and sound of the XO over the S9 Pro. And I thought this was probably also a good time to bring a third dongle into the mix and see if these two, being the XO and the S9 Pro, are actually competing at a higher level than their price. And so I grabbed the Moondrop Moonriver 2, which retails off the top of my head for $199, so it's significantly more expensive than either of these, but I was curious to see if that's netting you better sound. One of the tracks I used for this comparison was Work On Me by Joan Osborne, and again I used both of those IEMs that I've mentioned before and tried this time all three dongles with balanced outputs each time. Starting this time with the S9 Pro, and the sound quality was fantastic. There's a good sense of clarity and presence in the vocals, everything sounds really well defined, the percussion in this track sounds excellent through the S9 Pro, but I was aware that it was a fairly compact soundstage overall, and that could be part of the track, so I was going to compare it when we move through the other dongles. But starting with the S9 Pro, there was nothing at all to complain about. I mentioned before it's got that slightly V-shaped sound, but it's not like it's ever enough that on its own it's a problem. It was just something I noticed in comparison with the XO. When I moved over to the XO using the blue filter again, what I heard was a smoother delivery once again, as you'd probably expect from what I've already said. It had a more present sense of mid-range to it. And so what happened was Joan Osborne's vocals, which were very kind of textured and clean, they had a bit of air to them, but still a sense of richness, that was from the S9 Pro. When I went over to the XO, they got just a little bit more buttery and smooth, or creamy you could say. And I know those are weird words to use in an audiophile context, but my point here is that the sound from the XO just brings a bit of extra kind of, not euphony, it doesn't go that far, it's not colouring the sound significantly, but it's also not quite as top-end focused as something like the S9 Pro. And honestly, I think the XO might be the more true-to-life presentation. Obviously, I have no way of knowing what the recording actually is meant to sound like, but to me, the XO gave me a better sense of the vocals in every way. I was still hearing texture and clarity and air, but also a bit more of the richness and the harmonics of the voice too. It wasn't thick in any way, I want to make that really clear, but it definitely had a bit more presence to it. Similarly, when listening from the XO, there's a guitar in this track that I didn't really notice from the S9 Pro because it was drawing my attention to things like the percussion and the bass. Whereas from the XO, because I think things are just a little bit better balanced and we're talking 1 to 2% difference. But what that allowed me to do was actually notice the guitar and notice the sense of richness and quality within the guitar as well. And I really liked that from the XO. The percussion that I mentioned just a moment ago wasn't quite as pronounced from the XO compared to the S9 Pro, but it was still very clear and very detailed. Once I actually took a moment to listen for it, it was definitely there. But perhaps you could say it was better balanced with the mix, or perhaps the S9 Pro does a better job of the percussion and those sorts of high frequencies. That's going to be up to a personal preference decision. Both are excellent, but I do like the way the XO balances things out. And so where I'd gotten to at this point is I think both the S9 Pro and the XO are fantastic. I'm going to come back around to the ITM02 shortly because I think that's fantastic too in its own place. But as I mentioned, I'd also picked up at this point the Moondrop Moonriver 2. And if you want my full review on that one, that's in a recent dongle fondle. If you search Moonriver 2 on the channel, you should find that one pretty easily. And so I plugged in the Moonriver 2 to see how it compared on the same track still, which is Work On Me by Joan Osborne. I plugged it in to see if it's worth spending what could be more than double something like the XO to get extra performance. And what I heard was a device that's probably more similar in tonality to the S9 Pro rather than the XO. And what I mean by that is that the Moondrop Moonriver 2 has a slightly more etched sound to it. It's just a little bit more kind of upper end and lower end focused with less mid-range richness. But at the same time, it's not exactly the same as the S9 Pro because I was finding it was definitely resolving details better. It was focusing the image better. The vocals are beautifully separated from the rest of the mix. The percussion's really clean as well, but nothing's overdone from the Moonriver 2. It's essentially taking what's probably almost a halfway point between the XO and the S9 Pro, and I'd say probably if you put the S9 Pro here and the XO here, it's probably just a little bit towards the S9 Pro, but not identical in terms of tonality. But it's taking what the two of those offer and giving you better again, as you'd hope for the extra price. There are some plucked strings in this track at around about the 1:40 mark, and the plucked strings sounded great, and what I mean by plucked strings is like an orchestra, but they're plucking. The plucked strings sounded really good from all of these devices, but in particular, the Moonriver 2 just brought them more alive. And I think that's because it's bringing out more of the nuances of the sound. The extra details that it's resolving will include things like the really subtle reflections in the room, some of the really subtle harmonics of the instruments. It's just doing a better job with those. And so it is worth spending more on the Moonriver 2, but what it showed me is that you're already getting fantastic performance for $100 or just over $100 with either the S9 Pro or the XO. And so at this point, having tried lots of different tracks, lots of different IEMs, some headphones, some different music, I was very comfortable making my conclusions on this one. And that is to say that with the 3 dongles I've got here in front of me, there was absolutely not a bad choice. And I'm going to pause for a moment here and say, if you're not familiar with the channel and you hear that and you think I'm just here to sell these devices, please go and look at some of the other dongle fondles, because I don't say everything's good. There are plenty of reviews where I've said that a device isn't particularly good and you should steer clear of it or choose something else. But I'm really pleased to say that on this occasion, I think all 3 of these are great choices. Having said that, I am going to help you make a clear decision for yourself. And that is to say that if you are limited to a budget of no more than $60, then the ITM02 is going to be one of the best options you can get. At the time that I reviewed it, the xDuoo Link V2, which I spoke about before, was one of the best I'd tried below $60, and to me the ITM02 clearly goes a step better again. And so I'm really comfortable recommending that if you've got a limited budget, and what I mean by that is anything under whatever the price of the XO is. But what I'm also going to say is that if you can spend more money, then absolutely think about going for the XO or the S9 Pro, depending on your budget and your preferences. And that brings me to the second part of this recommendation, which is that if you're looking at the 2 of these, the S9 Pro and the XO, then it's really going to come down to preferences. Both of these are fantastic devices in their own right. I would be very happy using either of these as my only dongle. But with that said, if you were to ask me to choose a preference, I would be going for the XO. And not just because it's probably going to be a little bit cheaper, but because I think it sounds better too. There are going to be those of you out there that are going to absolutely prefer kind of the detail-oriented sound, the extra resolution that you can perceive from the S9 Pro because of its tuning, but I don't think it's actually giving you anything that the XO doesn't. And what I mean by that is I think the XO sounds a bit different because its tonality is a bit different, but I think both are delivering equal levels of performance, they're just delivering it differently. And so as I said before, if it was me buying it, I'd be buying the XO. But if you're someone that prefers a bit more detail, a bit more resolution, that slightly more dynamic kind of V-shaped-ish sound, and I don't want to overplay that, it's not an extreme difference. But if you like the sound of a bit of extra punch in the bass and a bit of extra sparkle in the treble, the S9 Pro is going to be the better choice. But for me, the XO is the one that I would reach for from a pure sonic perspective. And remember that the single-ended output sounds just as good or maybe even better from the XO. So if you don't want balanced, but you're just looking for a good dongle, the XO is still a great choice. And then as one final reminder, I do want to point out that we've got MQA on the XO in case you'd forgotten which one did which. We've got MQA on the XO. We don't have it on the other devices. You've got Apple Lightning capabilities from the ITM02, and you've got maximum DSD and PCM from the S9 Pro if that's relevant. So you really can't go wrong here. Make the decisions based on your budget and your preferences, and features if it's relevant with things like MQA and sample rates. And so hopefully I've been able to help you clarify which one could be right for you and which one you think you're going to like most. If you have found the review useful and or helpful, I'd love it as always if you hit the like button and consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music. So happy listening, happy dongle fondling, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.